From the point of view of studying muscle function, there are two general modes of muscle contraction. The first is isometric, or fixed length contraction. This would occur if both ends of a muscle were fixed. In this case, the muscle is able to develop tension, but it cannot shorten. A real-world equivalent to this would be attempting to lift a weight that is simply too heavy for us to move. Your muscles would develop a lot of force, but could not shorten to move the object. The second general mode is isotonic contractions, also called a fixed load contraction, and this will occur if a muscle is able to shorten and carry a given load. In this session, we'll use these examples to demonstrate the length tension and force velocity relationships that underlie some important ideas in muscle mechanics. Muscle length is a particularly important determinant of the force of contraction. The length-tension relationship discussed here is studied under isometric condition. A resting muscle behaves like a rubber band, requiring force to stretch it to different lengths. The preload is the amount of force applied to a resting muscle before it is stimulated, creating a passive tension. That is denoted here on this upper graph with the blue line here, as increasing amounts of stretch are placed or preload are placed on that muscle, we would record more and more tension or force in that muscle. But at this point, the muscle has not been asked to actively contract. We would then stimulate the muscle electrically, and this would cause an active contraction, an active tension then added on top of this passive resting tension. So the total tension here is what's recorded when we start by stretching the muscle to a certain length and then stimulate the muscle. The difference between these 2 points indicates the amount of force the muscle itself produced. When we do this experiment, it's clear that there is an optimal range of muscle length, or preload, that produces a maximal contraction. Note that the amount of force here for the same amount of electric stimulation is greater than the force either at low levels of resting length or at high levels of stretched resting length. The lower graph here explains why this phenomenon exists, thinking about sarcomeres. At very short or very long muscle lengths, the active force development declines, producing our characteristic length-tension relationship. The plateau, or the peak here, reflects optimal overlap of thin and thick filaments within a sarcomere, providing maximum myosin cross-bridge binding. On the ascending limb here, between X and Y, the muscle is too short, and this results in double overlap of thin filaments and the attachment of fewer cross bridges. On the descending limb of the curve, the muscle is now too long, resulting again in inadequate overlap of thin and thick filaments. Of interest, skeletal muscles operate right at the plateau of their length-tension relation at all times, and that is because the bony attachments of muscles establish the resting length of the muscle. However, imagine this was a cardiac muscle, another striated muscle. In cardiac muscle, the preload or stretch on the resting myocyte will vary according to the amount of venous return. In the healthy heart, an increase in preload will stretch the cardiac myocytes, resulting in a more forceful and speedy contraction. However, in a diseased heart, such as in ventricular hypertrophy, cardiac muscle can become stiff, impairing its ability to stretch. Increasing preload in such a setting will mainly increase the pressures in the heart without the benefit of improved contractile force. When muscle performance was studied under isotonic conditions and a weight was being moved, this gives the opportunity to measure the initial speed of shortening, and that develops something called the force-velocity relation. So in these experiments, looking at panel A first of all, a piece of muscle was given an initial preload, and then with that preload, additional weights were then added afterwards prior to active stimulation. And what you can see here in this graph is the relationship between the total amount of load and the effect that has on shortening velocity. And as common sense dictates, the heavier the amount of load that you put on the muscle, the slower is the velocity of shortening. There are a couple of important ideas that come from this experiment. The first is the notion of afterload. It's given the name afterload because these were the weights added after a preload had been set, and it represents the amount of impedance that exists to muscle contraction. And that word afterload will be used extensively when we talk about cardiac mechanics. The other variable that this experiment produced was the notion of Vmax. So if we are to extrapolate this graph backwards to the y-axis intercept, this provides the theoretical maximum shortening velocity that could occur if in theory there was no load on the muscle at all. And it turns out that Vmax represents the intrinsic myosin ATPase activity. Well, when experiments are done like in panel B here, where on the green line we actually increase the preload, what we find is that indeed the performance of the muscle improves, that the speed of shortening is higher across a range of weights than at a shorter preload. However, when you extrapolate all of these curves backwards, you never find a change in the Vmax. So Vmax is not dependent on the length of the muscle. Now, when people did experiments to see if these things are important to the regulation of skeletal muscle, it turns out that they're really not. Skeletal muscle does not vary its Vmax. Skeletal muscle does not vary its preload. As we've seen, skeletal muscle regulates its force of contraction because the nervous system tells it what to do, either with more action potentials or by providing more or less motor units. However, it turned out that these concepts are very important in cardiac muscle. As we've seen already, preload can be changed in cardiac muscle. It turns out that Vmax can also be changed in cardiac muscle, because when it is activated by the sympathetic nervous system, the intrinsic rate of myosin ATPase activity in a cardiac muscle increases. And so for a given amount of preload or afterload, the muscle contracts more strongly, such as when we're exercising. This can be shown in a variety of different ways, but on these curves, it represents an increase in the Vmax, which only occurs in the cardiac, not in the skeletal muscle. So the force-velocity relation, although it was initially studied in skeletal muscle, generates a couple of concepts in afterload and contractility that become critical later on when we discuss cardiac muscle. In the final cell and general physiology session, we'll introduce smooth muscle before we get into the body systems.